My co-host today is Olivarez, and you get to be in attendance for a new Zoom format this evening, where Holly and I will have the same Zoom backgrounds for the duration of the presentation, and we'll be taking turns talking throughout the presentation. So let me go ahead and introduce Holly.
Hi, everyone. Before we get started this evening, I want to just take a moment to acknowledge this extensive but incomplete list of Black United States Americans who have been senselessly murdered. I also want to acknowledge that there are some on this call that will wish more, if not all of this presentation, were about racial injustice. It's certainly on all of our minds. Cal and I scheduled this presentation a while ago and decided to go ahead with it because our work is connected to racial injustice. And so we're going to talk more about that in our presentation. So let's get started. Cal, take it away.
All right, yeah, and I would like to also acknowledge my commitment to just listening, learning, and acting as an anti-racist. The format of today's presentation will go something like this. I'm going to talk about my perspective as an artist, and then Holly will talk about her role as a scientist and climate change communicator. Then we'll talk about our collaboration, and we also, at the end, want to save some time to just bring you all in and ask where you're at. So I've been a lifelong artist and self-taught from Crayolas and eventually graduated to moleskins, micro pens, half pan watercolors, and a water brush. Those are things that are easily, they're mobile, and I learned how to just carry these tools in my pockets and sketching wherever I went. I traveled pretty extensively, and I've got over 24 moleskins filled with little sketches from life, and those are my one of my greatest treasures. I've carried these things through 2 life-defining experiences in the AmeriCorps and Peace Corps, which served as the basis for most of my my career in community development. Basically, wherever I went, I was an artist sketching and making art. It wasn't until I went to India did I truly discover the power that I had as an artist. I was there on an American India Foundation Fellowship for a year doing community development work. Long story short, I worked on a team who we were working with communities of rural rug weavers. And the biggest challenge there is that I can't speak Hindi. So during interviews and surveys in communities, I would draw scenes and people. I would always show people what I was drawing, and most times I would ask people to draw their signatures. So I would hand over my sketchbooks, and they would get to see what I drew, and then they could have the interaction of drawing on my drawings. And these would serve as moments to connect with smiles, because art bridges culture, languages, and lay versus professional jargon. And this includes music, theater, and dance. They really touch our most human instincts of thoughts and emotions. I've just found that illustration and visuals work for me. And during team meetings where we were reviewing interviews and things we saw, we would talk for hours. And when we would talk for hours, I decided I would just draw out my ideas, because that's how that's how I process information. And that's not something that I saw in community development practices very often until up to that point. But being able to create images helped us see our ideas and then build on them. And this is when I realized the power of visuals being valid for even the most professional settings and complex communication. And these drawings helped us in our ideations. And then when we would pitch our ideas out to the public or people who we were working with. When I realized when art is an incredibly powerful translation tool, and connecting with people like Holly, who's a scientist full of information and insights, gives me the opportunities to confront climate change, which is bigger than my art alone could ever be. And why does art work as a powerful translation tool? Well, because our ancestors started drawing 32,000 years ago, and we really haven't stopped. Our brains are literally wired for visuals. The author Dan Rome points out that more of our brain's total processing capacity is dedicated to vision than to any other thing we do, more than to memory, more than to rational thought, and far more than to listening and feeling. And yet, most of us remain profoundly uncomfortable with visually expressing our ideas, in spite of the fact that we perceive far more of our ideas in our heads as images than as words. Dan Rome is a big inspiration of mine, and he wrote these great books that I would recommend about using visuals and specifically drawings and communication practices. And if you want to start, I would suggest The Back of the Napkin as the first read. It's really fascinating, but in his work, he encourages drawing to communicate ideas. And he lays out theories of our innate visual language structure, which is reflective of our verbal language structure, which are all really reflections of how our brains process information about our world. And I'll share this quote from Dan Rome for why visuals and art are important, particularly communicating complex issues like climate change. And he says, the single greatest challenge to leaders today, including thinkers, teachers, managers, presidents, parents, designers, CEOs, and students, basically all of us, is this: we have to make more incredibly complex ideas more clear, more quickly, and more persuasively than ever to more audiences who are more informed and have more access to more information than ever. Want to make a difference? Be vivid, or be able to communicate with visuals. And for a complex issue like climate change, something that I want to be involved in, I can and do proactively use visuals strategically when I communicate, but I'm not a scientist. I don't know the information. And that is what led me to find Holly, who is a scientist, who's passionate, charismatic, informed, and believes in communicating for change. And so now I'll turn it over to Holly to talk about her experience as a scientist and how we've worked together.
Wow, Kyle, that's really great. It helps me understand your approach as you've worked with me on our project. So it's really fascinating to me. And I always appreciate hearing your story and how it came about, how you came to be before I met you. So about me, I'm an oceanographer at CU Boulder. Yes, an oceanographer who works in the mountains. I came to Boulder last August to meet climate scientists and to continue studying how the climate system works and to figure out what to do about climate change. The most important thing we can do to help solve climate change today is to talk about it. A key point to understand about climate change, though, is that it doesn't happen all at once and in equal parts across the planet. There are places in the world that are already in distress because of climate change, while other places don't realize they are being impacted by it yet, kind of like here in the United States. Given this, it's important to think about climate justice, that our actions affect other people who do not live where we live. And given world events following George Floyd's senseless murder, Cal and I are concentrated on the idea that there will be no climate justice until there is racial justice. We're interested in continuing this conversation, so after our presentation, if you'd like to talk more, feel free. We will have time for discussion. Or if you'd like to chat with us another time, you can reach us by way of phone, Zoom, text, or social media. I've included my social media handle that I use on the 4 apps shown here. And then I also created a simple website where I share some resources that you can share on social media. The resources come from company and organizations that share content that's easy to reshare and helps you kind of generate or maybe start educating yourself and your family and friends about climate change. And it's kind of a a really nice introduction or a way to encourage more conversation about what's going on in terms of climate change. Cal and I, we ran a communications experiment earlier this year in how to present my scientific research about the ocean and climate change. So here in the pictures of me, next to me, are my professional headshot that I used to use in all of my communications prior to meeting Cal. And Cal designed me a logo that I now use everywhere. And this logo is so much more effective in building up my name as a scientist that communicates a little bit differently than the rest. And it also clearly shows that I'm interested in talking about climate change. And I really love that. So I'm really enjoying getting to use this logo. It really has been a conversation starter, which is great. So after Cal drew what I now use as my logo, the experiment began by Cal taking my old research presentation that was filled with boring graphs like this one, and then translating my research into illustrations and animations that tell a story visually and keep the concepts engaging and understandable to someone who doesn't do this kind of work every day. I study the ocean as an important component of climate change. We don't live in the ocean though. So through Cal's and mine collaboration, Cal figured out how to translate my science slides into illustrations that help people make a connection to climate change, rather than just displaying data and facts about the ocean. So here, for example, instead of talking about what air to sea CO2 flux is, Cal created new illustrations like the one in the bottom half, where I describe what carbon dioxide is. And I say instead that I estimate how much carbon dioxide goes into the ocean. And another example, instead of talking about block bootstrapping to recreate the internal component of air to sea CO2 flux, and I know some of you are laughing on the call because you speak this language Monday through Friday. Instead, I started saying, through my work, I'm able to help scientists around the world to better track the health of our planet. So after giving the talk a couple of times, Cal and I started thinking about what could be even more effective. First, most people don't look at charts and graphs and make a connection about how the graph translates to what they can do about climate change. But they can relate to concepts we all know, and they can use those concepts to understand what they can do. Second, data and facts do not change people's minds. I'm not passionate about climate change because of data and facts. I'm passionate about climate change because of how it will impact the people that I love. And shout out to my daughter who's on the call right now. And third, and most of all, in my opinion, no one wants to hear about how bad things are going to get. It's depressing and it's paralyzing. So instead, we can get people talking about solutions or what society can be like. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So the old logic in climate change communication was to provide information. And by providing that information, that anyone in receipt of it will receive it and know what to do. But this makes several assumptions. First, it assumes that communication is merely an information transfer. It also presumes a one-way flow of communication. And it presumes that everyone is already on the same page prior to that communication. And as we all know about climate change, everyone is not on the same page. Another example of the old logic is that climate change is our fault or my fault. Lectures and exhibits like this assume that any knowledge gaps are on the side of the public and that is at the root of the problem. So Cal and I decided to throw out the old logic and to start working on a new framework in which to use the arts to prompt people to talk about climate change in their daily lives. Right now, this is the #1 thing that we can do to solve climate change. and I'm going to talk about that. So there's a group at the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication that has been surveying United States Americans for the last 20 years about climate, about global warming, as we used to refer to it. Now we call it climate change. They're the same. So last November, they asked people if they think global warming is happening, and 67% said they think it is. The colors on this map are divided by county, and anything that's yellow, orange, or red means more than 50%, and the cool colors, or the blues, mean less than 50%. So the map here is showing lots of yellow and oranges. So this is good that people know that climate change is happening, because it is. They then asked, the surveyors then asked United States Americans if they think global warming will harm plants and animals, and 69% said yes. They then asked respondents if they think global warming or climate change will harm future generations. The map is still yellow and orange at 62%. Next question, do you think global warming will harm people in developing countries? And the number remained at 62%. So in summary, United States Americans think global warming or climate change is happening, that it will harm plants and animals, and that it will harm future generations, and that it will harm people in developing countries. But what about in the United States? That number goes down. Fewer people think that climate change will harm people in the United States. So we're still at more than half at 57%, but the map is becoming less yellow and orange, and some blue is starting to pop up. This shows us that people aren't too confident that climate change will harm people in the United States. And wait until you see what's next. When they ask people if they think climate change will harm them personally, that map changes colors. Only 42% thought climate change would harm them personally. Almost the whole map has gone blue, actually. So we went from a yellow and orange map to a blue one when things got personal. That's such an interesting observation. So why do people think that they won't be harmed personally by climate change when studies and articles are already showing that we in the United States all are being impacted, with some already being harmed by it as it acts as fuel to supercharge floods, droughts, and fires? The maps from the Yale program show that we think this only matters to the polar bears and to people far away, but the reality is that climate change is impacting us now. So an example of this, according to the US News in March 2019, air pollution is responsible for almost 9 million deaths per year. And Scientific American tells us that people who live in the poorest neighborhoods breathe in more hazardous particles, particles. Approximately 71% of Black people live in counties in violation of air pollution standards, according to the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. The latest report says climate change is expected to affect the health of millions of people directly. First directly from enhanced heat waves, floods, and storms. And then secondly, indirectly by increased smog and ozone in cities, contributing to the spread of infectious diseases and reducing the availability and quality of food and water. So this speaks to just one example of the racial injustice happening now in our country. There are many, but this is something that we can use to motivate us when we're thinking about how to solve climate change. So where do we get started in creating this new intersection of the arts and climate change communication? Well, let's first define our audience. And let's define our audience as everyone who wants a safe place to live, and healthy families, and healthy friends, and healthy communities. When we put it in this context, every human cares about climate change. And as we create this new intersection of the arts and climate change communication, let's ask ourselves, what is the goal? Is it to save the world? What does saving the world really mean? Does anyone really feel like they can save the world? How about instead, we shift the goal to something each and every one of us can do every day, and that's to talk about climate change in our daily lives. As the opinion maps we looked at showed, people are not talking about climate change because they think it won't impact them. And I wonder if this is why we've gotten complacent about talking about racism in our daily lives too. But if we recognize and we feel like it does impact us, which it does because it turns out it's all connected, then we'll talk about it. And if we're talking about it, we're inclined to do something about it. Art can prompt emotion in a way that words cannot. Artists like you that are on the call now can influence the conversation about climate change. Talking about climate change is the #1 thing that everyone can do right now. And you can not only prompt that, but get people talking about solutions or what society can be like. We've all seen the exhibits of climate change gloom and doom, and while they're effective at stirring emotions like sadness and despair do not prompt dialogue about solutions and what society can be like. The new intersection of the arts and climate change communication is one of solutions and of creativity. So how do we communicate a message of solutions and of creativity? Well, Cal and I are learning that it's by amplifying the stories of those who need our help and the solutions the most. So Cal and I decided to share our story this evening in the hopes that we can inspire ideas and further dialogue about combining the arts and climate change communication as a powerful way to influence our audiences. If we can get people talking about climate change, they'll be more inclined to do something about climate change. The key here is to find your unique way to help others get talking about it. The connection between racial injustice and climate injustice can be seen in many ways, and bringing that to light will not only prompt conversation, but it also invites a diverse group to come together and get creative and find solutions. Cal and I work to weave hope and solutions into our messages. We both are making the commitment to amplify the voices of those impacted by climate injustice the most. In the United States, these are the Black and other groups of people of color. Lastly, I urge each of you to find your unique ways to talk about climate change in your daily life. The connections are all around us, and the more we talk about it, the more we see it. And this prompts our creative brains to start finding solutions. Humans really are really smart, and we're very creative, and we can figure out how to come together and find solutions. I really believe that. So I'm going to turn it back over to Cal.
All right, thanks, Holly. And so let's talk about this together. What did you think? Did we spark ideas about partnering with scientists to turn their message into a medium we respond to in a deeper way than graphs and charts? And how are you, or how do you see yourself using your incredible artistic skills, whatever mediums they may be, to inspire people to talk about climate change? We're going to open this up to discussion, so feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to comment or have a question, or just type it into the chat bar. And I'll give a couple moments because it takes a couple moments to think of a question, but yeah, feel free to unmute yourself and ask it or type it into the chat bar.
Well, I'm curious, are you familiar with the Cape Farewell Project?
I've heard of it, but I couldn't say I'm fluent.
Right, it was organized, well, I have a friend who works in Greenpeace, and he was the organizer from that end, and they invited several artists per year to actually go on a trip in a boat up to the Arctic.
Mhm.
and really just take it in and approach in whatever way they wanted the issue. And it's been going for a while. I thought it was fascinating. They had an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London that was tremendous. But my friend at Greenpeace, he actually got a little disillusioned with that. He just felt it wasn't going fast enough. He was transitioning into advising corporations on how they could become more green, because there was a bit of a tipping point that was happening.
Mhm.
Right now, he's saying that a lot of people in the field are shifting, largely after Standing Rock, towards working with indigenous populations.
Mhm.
So in some ways, what I'm curious about, and a little daunted by, is to make a connection between that really sophisticated art, which is actually it's not full of that kind of despair and exhibiting the worst case scenario, but it's actually very fascinating with working with indigenous populations.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering, well, I guess I'm very curious about what's happening in Colorado in terms of collaborations with indigenous populations to raise awareness around climate change.
Good question.
I can speak
Yeah.
to that a little bit.
Great.
Hi, everybody. I'm Erin Leckie, and my background is in climate science. And I'm with CU Boulder in the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences. And specifically, though, the group, that's just a giant research institute. But our little group within that is really about taking all of the climate and environmental science that this huge research institute produces and turning it into programs that can help people engage with it. And one of the programs that we started just this year is about water in the Four Corners region. And what we've done is to develop, actually we're still developing, we're trying to co-develop it with rural and tribal partners across the Four Corners region to really address and help bridge the Western science with traditional ways of knowing. And we have a lot of Native and Indigenous partners who are helping us, although we have to recognize too that they are, particularly our partners in the Navajo Nation, are right now up against really horrible conditions where they're just being decimated by the current pandemic on top of everything else. So so efforts like ours are, and we're just one of many, but I just like, little sign of people who are trying to use art and storytelling to build bridges and amplify the voices of Indigenous communities.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for answering that. Sorry, I'm just answering somebody in the chat. I am new enough to Colorado that I couldn't answer that. I'm from New Mexico, that's where I moved from. And there are definitely teams of scientists that are working in many different ways in trying to remediate uranium from the uranium mining that happened in the Four Corners area and across New Mexico. But I can't say that they're necessarily using art. Yeah, so I think bringing art into this conversation really is going to transform the audience of people that perhaps we've been missing using all the other means that we've been trying. I don't know, I say we, meaning all of us, not me, and not just scientists. Of course, there are people that are, we're trying all these different avenues, but what Cal and I were working on, what we started working on, we got pretty excited about, and it's gone really well. I think we've given, well, this is the first time we both talked. Usually he's helping me behind the scenes and then I do the talking. But I want to say, I lost track, 6 or 7 events that we've done now with really great success, where typically when I give a scientific talk, I hear you did a great job, and then that's kind of the end of it. But with these, with the talks that I've been giving with the illustrations, we have really interesting and inspiring dialogue. I say inspiring, I'm using that word in the context of something actually comes from it, where someone is doing something, like another collaboration happens, or people team up, or it leads to another event, kind of like this one did, things like that. And then not only that, I'll actually hear back from other people that have very specific comments about the presentation, whether it be the content or the illustrations. But typically after a scientific talk, I don't get feedback, you know, the next day or 2 days later. And so I feel like that's a marker of success when you're still on someone's mind the next day, not meaning me, but meaning the message, the content, whether it be the illustrations or talking about climate change. So I'm just thrilled about it. I'm ready to take this over to CU and NCAR and say, scientists, let's do this. Climate scientists, let's do this. I know I have a few like-minded scientist colleagues on the call. In particular, I'm looking at Patrick Chandler, who's also doing a lot of work in the arena of science and art. So if you have anything you'd like to add, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if you have anything to add, I would sure welcome it.
Sure. Yeah, I know a lot of folks on this call. You know what? One thing I want to throw out there in response to indigenous populations working in this realm, it's really interesting when you start to talk about science and art and knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge. I was at AGU last year at a panel that focused on indigenous perspectives, and one of the speakers got up and just started with traditional ecological knowledge stories. No preface, no introduction. Got up and started talking about the myth of Raven and the world. And then when his time was up, he stopped where he was at in his story and walked away. And so I think that there are many places that we don't understand modes of communication, and in the indigenous realm, it's story and narrative in a way that we simply are not accustomed to diving into. But I think that there's a lot going on there, and as we expand this realm of science and art partnerships, one of the biggest risks that I see, and I'd be curious to get y'all's perspective on it, is that when it comes to communicating climate change, the typical model has been, how can we use the arts to communicate the science, rather than how can we maintain the integrity of the arts and the sciences to be equal partners in the work of communication. And I think as we move further down that road and further away from co-opting the arts to communicate science, we'll come to better understand, respect, and include things such as traditional ecological knowledge as maintaining its own integrity and included in that system.
Yeah, very well said. Anyone else before I say all the things?
Well,
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
So Darren Tui here. I'm also a scientist. I'm at CU Boulder in the Atmospheric and Oceanic Science Department. But I just want to say first, Cal and Holly, you guys did an awesome job. It's really great.
Thanks.
And I say that as a complete non-expert at the arts. But what I do want to do quickly here is relate a story to you, which I think will resonate really well and give you an example of where I've seen this resonate. And I worked about 9 years ago at the State Department, and I was a science fellow, and I was trying to translate not my work, but what I understood about the climate issue and air pollution and whatnot to people in Washington, D.C. And of course, everything was over their heads every time I spoke, right? But one of the people there liked science, and he got really enthusiastic about some of the things I was telling him, put me in a really interesting spot because he actually knew more than he admitted. And he is now leaving very soon, but he's been working in Rome and he's been working with the Vatican. And a couple of years ago, we came up with this idea to try to spread the science through the arts and humanities. And I'm not good at that, but I told him what I would like to do. We still haven't done it. It's tricky, and right now it's not easy at all with the COVID situation. But I do want to say that with the Pope's encyclical on climate change, and I guess today or yesterday he came out with some updates, the translation of the science into the realm of individuals and localities and their daily lives is that idea is exactly what the State Department folks were interested in doing based on their experience. And it might be similar to what Cal experienced when he was in India, that when you see people and you see it affect their daily lives, you can come up with far better analogies and far better examples. We do it, scientists do it when we get on planes, we do it when we give talks. We try to translate things when we understand who people are and where they're coming from better. So I just want to put that out there because politically you can guess right now. You might think now would be a time to not push these kinds of things, but it turns out these people, even with this change of administration, are still very, very open to this because the arts and humanities bring so much more to people and it isn't politicized like science is. So I just wanted to mention that. I'm happy to talk more about it some other time, maybe and train some of you in this endeavor if you want to be help in some ways in the future. But anyway, that's my little story I just wanted to add.
Thanks, Darren. Kit?
Yeah, I just wanted to throw out the, to follow up on what was said before about really trying to kind of get to a point where artists and scientists are meeting as equals, which is kind of a challenge because there is, different languages spoken in each discipline, and some people are better at actually reaching across disciplines than others. And I've been noticing an upsurge of artists in residence programs. One good example is New York City. The Department of Cultural Affairs has a really good commissioner. He's been there for maybe 5 years, I think. But they actually place artists in residence in city utilities. So in a way, it's like transforming the perception from within. And really, basically, an artist going in not really knowing what the quote problem unquote is or the culture is, and either addressing a problem or not, or just basically lifting the awareness within the organization. And in this case, the ideal would be to go into an oil and gas industry that is exploring alternative energy and getting an artist on the case and actually, in a way, allowing that the process to be accelerated in terms of the entire company visualizing the possibility of going to renewables. But I think artists in residence, I think the excellent points I've made so far would really accelerate those.
Yeah. So I would like to share.
Great. Please. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess this is a different perspective. This is an art perspective, art and humanities. I'm a member of a group called Inspire. There are 5 of us. We're visual artists and poets. And we actually had an exhibit about climate change at NCAR in the summer of 2018. And my specialty is fiber arts, which is very different than drawing. I don't consider myself somebody who can draw. But I have about 10 fiber art pieces, I guess, that present ideas around climate change. And they vary quite a bit. The theme of our show was taking steps. So the idea was to show people what our concerns are, in some cases very dramatically, but also to have poetry that was uplifting. And at the end of the exhibit, we had an interactive piece. We asked people to write down on strips of cloth what they could do about climate change and tie that on the cloth. right now, not much is happening because of COVID, and I feel somewhat frustrated by that. It's interesting to hear what you're saying. I felt like the social, the injustice part is really an important part of what's happening with climate change. And I think it's challenging to think about how to do that as a privileged white person, because I think it's those people who need to carry that story forward, talking about storytelling. But I do think that's, the time is right for that. And I'm interested in this topic because I want to know how I can keep the momentum going in terms of what I think is the most crucial thing facing us today really is climate change. So anyway, that's it. Oh, the other thing is we did do 2 performances at NCAR. That's where the poetry came in.
That sounds amazing. Yeah, Cal and I were talking before the call. I thought maybe Cal, you might speak to it. We were talking earlier about how not everyone is an illustrator.
See, yeah, I would say that, like any art, like every art is valid in, like touching our base, like emotions and getting us to just understand different things. So like, I think theater, poetry, live poetry is like an incredible thing that I can't do. That's not my thing, but it is, like when I see it, it is powerful. Yeah, illustration was just a thing that was what I started doing and have done ever since. But yeah, other forms are equally valid and great.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah.
Lori D here, Lori Dameron. I've been a member of Boulder County Artists Alliance for, I don't know, probably 15 years or something. And thanks so much for all you guys do. Hello, Charlotte, I see you out there. So I've been doing a multimedia combining science and art and music. I have a presentation called Spaceship Earth, What Can I Do? And honestly, when I thought of the idea in 2012, I thought, people won't even care what it's about. It's got live music and photography. Let's go check it out. But I just have such a hard time booking it and filling seats. But the feedback is tremendous. So I just keep on. I actually did for Super Science Saturday at NCAR back in, I don't know, 2013 or 14. But I don't give up because like I'll run into somebody at the grocery and they'll say, oh, I recognize you. I saw your thing 2 years ago and I went home and I started doing this and this and this and compost and, and that's what I live for. So I just keep on trudging along. And see, I feel like combining the science and the art is using both sides of the brain, and so it makes an even stronger impact. And yeah, but it's just it's really frustrating. I'm really baffled at why I haven't had more success with it. And lately, I've been focusing on Jefferson County School District because a lot of people and schools in Jefferson County don't even have recycle. But my thing's all about reduce, reuse, striving for zero waste and conscious consumerism.
Yeah, sounds like you do great work. And you said you started, I wrote it down, Spaceship Earth, What Can I Do? Did you say 2012?
Yeah, that's when I started, put it together. And
yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So I think definitely I think it's a combination of things, definitely. And I'm not an expert on this call by any means. This is just my observations. I think it's a timing thing, being in the right place at the right time and catching people when it's on their minds. Like right now, as Lori, I think it's Lori G, was commenting that, this is on racial injustice is on our minds, and making that connection to climate injustice is a window of opportunity to really bring awareness But I also think that those Yale opinion maps are really telling in that people in the United States are not talking about climate change, and
Yeah.
that translates into they don't feel like it's something that needs to be a priority. It's kind of out there. It's either in the future or far away.
It's so true that they, how is it going to help me? They think, well,
right.
My gosh, it can help, like you said, healthier communities and
right.
Yeah.
Right. It's all connected. Yeah, absolutely. And I think too what Lori G, is it Lori G? I don't want to say it wrong. Okay. What Lori G was saying as well, I really hear you when you say that about how do we accomplish this in a way that's respectful, but also we know it's the right thing to do. And so my short training in this is an experience is to find those that are telling stories already and just amplify those. And I mean, it takes bravery and courage for those that are choosing to tell stories and to put themselves out there, whether it be in the form of poetry or writing or whatever that, or music, whatever that looks like for them. But finding ways to amplify them, I think, is key. I really think it's key. It brings empathy not only into your own practice and your own mindset, but it's evidence of, it's action, that you understand that this is all connected. Yeah, Julia.
First, it was a great presentation, both you and Cal. I really enjoyed it. And I was also very much laughing when you said, I know some people were laughing. So I was curious how, as you've started and gone through this project, how it's changed, how like what you thought you were going to communicate has changed. So things like, have there been concepts that have been particularly difficult or not translated well into graphics? How has like the ratio of like adaptation to climate versus sort of preventing more climate change, has that changed? Things like that.
Good question. Cal, do you want to answer the part that applies to you in terms of what has been difficult to translate?
I think I think when the way that Holly and I started collaborating was that we happened to go to similar events where I was actually drawing an event that Patrick Chandler was on a panel of, and then Holly was in the audience and she got to see some of my work, and then later on I was just reaching out to scientists who I wrote up an email to a listserv that said, are there any scientists out there that would like to collaborate with an artist? And that's kind of how Holly and I met. And I think that originally we started with some ideas that of doing more of like, I do whiteboard animations. And then eventually I saw that how Holly was such an amazing communicator on her own. And that's not, I think she has a really real gift, and seeing that her trajectory as a presenter really led us to just develop her work into visual slides. I think the challenges were trying to understand like what she wanted to communicate with my visuals, because while my visuals can communicate some things, they can't communicate all of the things that Holly's trying to express, because some of the information was just frankly too complex, and she can speak about it in a way that my illustrations just don't quite get there. So yeah, I think that's hopefully touches on that.
Well, I think I'll clarify what you were just saying. I think it's more that when he and I first started collaborating, I will say this because I think it's funny and you will all appreciate it. Every time that Cal and I would meet when we were in person, we would meet in a conference room at CU campus, and we never sat down. We were just too I guess excited about what we were working on. So we would have like 2-hour meetings, brainstorming meetings, and we'd be standing up at a table that had 15 chairs around it. But anyway, I think what I found challenging was trying to explain what I had on my slides to Cal, and meanwhile I could see his brain was just going, trying to figure out how do you translate that into something that's going to make sense for someone that doesn't do this every day. And so it was interesting to me because I don't think that I think like a scientist, but when I was trying to present it to him, I realized, wow, this is really difficult to explain to someone that doesn't do this every day. There's a lot of jargon and there's a lot of steps, right? There's a lot of steps that get you to that point where you understand what does it mean. And so ultimately, yes, there has been an evolution. We started with, I want to talk about the steps of my method of how I get to where I understand. And as we continued to have our brainstorming sessions, it came to be, well, that doesn't really matter. What really matters is how does what I do impact the people that are listening to me? That's what they care about. That's what I care about when I sit in on a talk. How does this impact me? And so ultimately, the short version is no one really cares what you do in your day job. I heard that from the communications person at our Institute for Arctic and Alpine Research, is the one that actually said it the first time. And I thought, wow, okay. But actually the truth is that what I do in my day-to-day research really isn't relevant when we're talking about how climate change is going to impact someone in their life. And like I said, I study the ocean. We don't live in the ocean, but we need to know about the ocean to understand climate change. And it's a very important, I would say, very important part of climate change. I'm biased. But you know, I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned is that I stopped trying to make my talk about my day-to-day goings on in my research and detached myself from that. And I'm able to say, I study the ocean, or I study the ocean and climate change. And when it comes to the technical stuff, then certainly I'm going to write a paper and I'm going to present it at a scientific conference. And I'm going to continue that conversation. I just had a couple of Zoom meetings yesterday where we were talking about where we're going to go next with the findings that I have and how interesting it is, what makes a difference if there's a strong El Nino event or if there's a volcanic eruption, how does that impact, you know, what I study, that sort of thing. But when it comes to giving a talk like this, none of that is relevant. It becomes more about, well, I think what I've witnessed as an audience member is a lot of talks about how bad things are going to get. And I would sit in the talks and think, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And that's what I heard. Number one question in the Q&A after every talk was, well, what do I do? What do I do? And no one really had any answers. I mean, scientists, we study the problem. We don't study the answers. We don't figure out what to do. That's not what we do. And so I understand why we haven't gotten to this intersection before. In some, I mean, of course, some people have. I don't mean to take away from those that have already been doing this. There's a wonderful group at CU that works specifically in climate change communication. Patrick is part of that group, and they do art installations and comedy shows, stand-up comedy shows about climate change, and they do some really great, really cool stuff. The difference, I think, is that Cal and I teamed up as scientist and illustrator to say, how can we use the science as part of our message? And so we want to make sure we're dead on the information that we're putting out there. I actually had Cal look up a citation for me before the talk today, because he suggested that something that we add, and I said, well, we need to make sure we can back that up. And so we want to make sure that we're being mindful that this climate change is a consensus. The idea of not the idea of climate change, that's the wrong word to use. That climate change happening and our understanding of climate change happening has come about from the consensus of thousands of scientists around the world. And so we constantly are consulting with one another and having dialogue with one another, because no one can stand up and say, we know everything there is to know about climate change. And we probably never will. We'll probably never know everything there is to know about gravity either. but we know enough to know to not stand too close to the edge of a cliff. So that's where we're at with climate change as well. We know enough, but certainly we're still trying to be mindful that we're accurate in our presentation. So it's definitely been a really great experience thus far, and I can't wait to see what we keep doing, because we just keep going. And so I'm really grateful for that. I'm grateful to have met Cal, because I think before I met him, I was on a different trajectory of, I was certainly concerned with climate change communication, but I didn't have that piece of understanding that I need to focus more on, I am a scientist and I understand the system, but what really matters is how does it impact you? Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. I was thinking of something else. It'll come back to me.
Yeah, Holly.
Good question.
Speak to that
Hannah,
a little bit too. So in 2016, I ended up collaborating with an artist for this exhibit at the New York Hall of Science. And I think that was one of the biggest things I had to learn too, was you're not trying to make your artist put a paper on an exhibit, you know? You're not trying to make someone create exactly the little gritty details of your science. And I think, yeah, as an advice to scientists, as you're working with artists, is it's not your job to control their creative process. And it's also, you have to really learn how to recognize that there are really different ways of presenting that same kind of information. And that even if it's not, oh, well, this doesn't have the 50,000 caveats that I would normally write about in my paper, it doesn't actually mean that it's not right and that it's not a valuable piece of information. And so really it is that, going back to what Holly said, it just, no one cares what you do in your day job. And when I was doing that, I was finishing my PhD, and it was hard for me to understand that, to the point when, like, we created this like amazing like cartoon video with this artist who I worked with, and it was phenomenal. But like some parts of it, I was like, but this doesn't really look like the Southern Ocean, or this doesn't really look like exactly what I'm supposed to study, and no one's going to understand. And if I show this to my scientist friends, they're all going to like laugh me out of the park, because they're going to think like, you don't know anything. You know, you should have told your artist to do something better. But it's not really about that. And I think remembering that people come at it from such a different place, you know, just trying to remember where you started as this, like before you really started your science trajectory. Like, I didn't think about the ocean as anything other than just water. And now I understand it in a completely different way, but I need to remember sometimes that that's often how people see it, and that's okay. So I think it's a really interesting and valuable process. So I would really encourage like any scientists on this call, if you ever get an opportunity to do that. Obviously, Holly is showing you, you know, living proof of how awesome it is to work with an artist. But it's super fun because, yeah, it forces you to think about how you're even communicating to your artist, like those complex ideas. And what is really valuable information versus not, you know, when it's actually disseminated to a broad audience. So that was awesome, Holly.
Yeah, that's really great insight. I was just thinking, I wonder if the artists on the call could liken it to, if you have a piece that's on, sorry if I don't have my jargon correct, but if you have a piece that's on display in an exhibit, and no one's really, you're not standing in front of it talking about the brand name of the brush that you purchased, or brushes that you purchased, or the brand name of the paint that you purchased, that sort of thing. So I think maybe there's some similarities there. I see Cal nodding. Maybe the other artists on the call could speak to that.
I'm sorry, I don't think I understand what it is.
Oh, I was trying to liken to what scientists get so focused on the day-to-day, their method, their scientific method, right? And so they get so caught up in the day-to-day operations of the work that they're doing that they kind of lose touch with what does it mean for the people that this is going out to, right? And so I was saying, can we liken that to an artist that has a finished piece that they're presenting? They're not concerned with everyone knowing the brand name of the brushes that they purchased, or not that that's not important, it is important, but they're not, it's not part of the presentation of the art piece. The art piece is the presentation of what does it mean.
Right. Well, I think that the beginning point is just totally different as an artist. At least the work that I've done around climate change, it's been conceptual in nature, or it's been an idea that I want to present. So that drives it, and I don't. Every decision I make is based on what materials can I use, what colors can I use to get the message out there. And then our group, our exhibit at NCAR, we were also able to have words next to it describing what our ideas were or what our concerns were, that maybe some questions, whatever. So I just think we come at it from a totally different direction.
Yeah, but I know for me, that's a big aha moment, that our approach, scientists are coming at it from a different angle, which would explain why they don't make that connection of what does this mean to my audience.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
For many people, Holly, I mean, you look at art, and it's a personal experience for most people. There's a subset of people who are artists who have discussions about art with other people, but for people, the general public, they're out and they see a piece of art and they think about it, and it maybe generates something personally, but maybe they don't talk about it with anyone. So one of the things that another part of the human being and human spirit and activity besides art, which is, as Cal mentioned, was 32,000 years old. The other thing is language and communications and storytelling, which of course the indigenous folks, that's what they do. They pass down through tradition. So in my spare time, I actually signed up for basically a storytelling class. There's a group in Boulder called the Spellbinders, and I took classes there, got certified. And what they do is they tell stories at nursing homes, and they also tell stories during the school to children in elementary school. So that's what I will be doing hopefully in the fall. So for the first time. And my goal really is to, take maybe a piece of art or a sculpture or maybe a drawing or a picture and have that as part of a story that I create for the class. Mm-hmm. And these children, of course, have to navigate the topics. I don't want to scare them, with what's going to happen with the world, right? But to spur a conversation in their mind so they are comfortable talking about this, hopefully with their parents, and following, political, there's all kinds of potholes everywhere, right? But my goal really is, and I'm still trying to construct, some of the stories that I would actually tell. And these are stories that, it's a one-way flow, so it's not necessarily discussion. But I'm interested in any kind of input or any ideas anyone has or suggestions on how I can navigate through this to have the most impact on society.
Yeah, that's really great. Well, plus I think I'm coming into the realization that really working with children is really key, because they really do impact their parents' decisions. But not only that, what we learned as children is ingrained in us as we get older, right? I know my son was in middle school, and I picked him up from school one day and he said, "Why aren't we recycling?" And that day we started recycling. And that was, I don't know how long ago that was, probably at least 10 years ago. And they're powerful.
So I had some experience with, I was a teacher for 40 years, and one of the decisions I made was to volunteer for Audubon to work in classrooms. And I guess one of my recommendations would be make sure that whatever you tell, whatever you do, is age appropriate. Yes. And I had, when I decided to volunteer in schools, my banner was climate change. And I learned fairly early on that was not appropriate for elementary age kids. We're doing other kinds of things, obviously a lot with birds, but also a lot with water and water quality and that kind of thing. But you know, we just had a volunteer meeting, Zoom meeting this last week, and the teachers are just really feeling pretty desperate because they don't know for sure if kids are going to be in schools or if they're going to be at home, and they may be in both places, and teachers are going to have to come up with a lot of content for kids to do on their own at home. And boy, I just really recommend that you contact some of the school districts and say that you are available for storytelling in schools. And there are wonderful stories for young kids too that touch on caring for animals in particular,
Yes.
but caring for the environment. So gosh, I just think you have a great resource to offer.
Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. The talk that Cal and I put together, I gave it for NCAR a few weeks ago. It was intended for, I think I was told to plan on 8th to 12th graders, was what they thought kind of their audience would be for that, but that's what it was used. It was exactly for that during the school semester, a place for parents to kind of provide some science to their students. But I used my slides in my talk that Cal and I put together, and it really went great. That being said, it was scheduled after the semester ended, and so I don't think we had any 8th to 12th graders on the call, but we still had a great discussion. But you've inspired me, Conrad, because I have material. I could offer to give that talk to teachers. And Lori, thank you for that. I can definitely do that.
Thank you.
May I throw something out there?
Yeah.
It's interesting, Lori, mentioning, you know, our elementary students ready for climate change conversations. And I'm doing a lot of work in that realm at the moment. And I feel like we're at a place where we're past the point of wondering if they're ready because they're getting it either way. And there's so much overwhelm in elementary and middle school because there are so many messages presented about the dangers, the calamities, the world-ending possibilities, and that if we choose not to address it in a way that provides pathways to action and invites youth to be authors of knowledge and initiators of action in their own communities, then we're doing a disservice to them that continues to add to that weight moving into the future, to the point where I see many students in college in a mode where they're like, we're screwed, so I'm not engaging. And I think that starting with elementary school is essential, actually. But I also think that the arts are essential to doing that, because it does provide pathways to messaging that can really focus on enabling those youth to take part in the thoughts and the actions that surround the issue.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. Just within the last maybe 2 years, we're seeing so many more youth that are coming forward, and they're very clear in their understanding of how urgent the situation is. And so those that are younger than the young generation that are speaking up are seeing that and paying attention to that. So I think you're right. I think that's a really valid point. Well, Cal and I decided that if things get quiet and we feel like we're done, then we can say good night. This has been great. Oh, Lori, yeah.
I do have a question. As an artist, there are times I have an idea that I want to present, and I want to make sure that the content is accurate, that I'm showing it in a way that really is accurate. And I wonder if you could suggest, how do we go about finding scientists who are willing to spend the time to talk with us, to maybe look at our piece or the idea, the concept, and give us some feedback on it?
That's the best question I've heard all evening. I'll speak to that, unless Patrick, you're probably more qualified than I, but I can say that CU Boulder is, there is a new center that is being formed. I think COVID-19 has slowed the efforts, like many things in the world right now, but there is a new climate change communication center. I don't think it's been officially announced, so don't consider this the official announcement. And I'm only on the periphery of it, but that is exactly what it is being created for, is so that scientists, actually I think it's a combination of scientists and those that provide services that help in the communication realm and the presentation realm, so that scientists can say, I have this project that I think the public would want to know about, but I don't know how to get it out there other than in my sciencey way. And then there will be consultants at the center that can pair them with artists and other folks that can provide services to them that will help translate their science into a way that's more effective. Is that, would you agree? I see
Well,
Erin smiling as well.
Patrick and I were just chatting about like who is gonna jump in next on this. But let me say, so there's something like 900 environmental sciences in the Research Institute that I'm part of, and I've been fortunate to work with some other Boulder County artists to put in grant proposals, and have started to develop kind of just like ears to the ground, and then also talking to our leadership and finding out what scientists are really interested in collaborations. And you would be surprised and hopefully thrilled at how many scientists are like, I would love to talk to an artist, I just don't know any artists. And so it's really great to be like, hey, we're looking at doing this installation that would have, X, Y, and Z components. And we noticed that you did this study about air quality in Boulder, and we want to put this in Boulder public spaces. And I've never had anyone say, oh no, that's not interesting to me, or I wouldn't dream of it. I mean, sometimes people are like, I've got a huge deadline next week, can you get back to me later? But so there's lots of great conduits, and I'm happy to be a matchmaker between artists and scientists, if that would be helpful.
Can you put that information in the chat, how I could contact you?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yay.
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 This is what I love.
There we go. That's me, and I can always get you to other people. So
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Erin. Great. Okay, anything else? Let's do this again. I know for sure Cal and I are going to continue to evolve in our efforts because we're a good match, and we keep kind of challenging one another for what's next. We're already doing it for what comes after this, and so we're having a lot of fun with it. And I feel like we're on the right path for some effective dialogue. And I think right now dialogue is the most important thing we need in terms of climate change. And so here we are having it, which is great. And then as time goes by, we're going to need more than dialogue. But because we will be talking about it, then we'll sort out what that looks like when the time comes. All right, Cal, any last thoughts?
I think that's it. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for participating in the dialogue. I thought that was all very interesting, and there were so many points that were brought up. And yeah, continue to follow Boulder County Arts Alliance, and then you've got all our information if you want to reach out. And but yeah, thanks so much to you, Holly, for being a part of this and being my best collaborator.
Fantastic. I love it. All right, everyone. Take care. Thank you so much for coming and participating. Yeah. We'll see you again.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Great.
All right.
Okay. I hate to log off before everyone else does. We have to be the gracious hosts. We get to be the gracious hosts.
Yeah. And I don't know, Holly, Charlotte and I are gonna stay on for a little longer.
Okay.
Hang out too.
Okay, good. Then I won't be so rude then. I'm going to leave the call. But thank you again. Thanks, Charlotte.
Thank
I
you.
look forward to meeting you again.
Yes.
Good.
And Holly,
Yeah, it was great.
if you wanted to hang on and I don't know, just talk for a moment, then longer. I don't know if you've got any place to go.
Sure. I'd be happy to give you feedback on the let's see, we can stop recording if you want. I'd be happy to give you